All right, so today we're going to be looking at the mysterious death of Alex Pennig. You gave us a 48 hours episode on it. It's called The Strange Shooting of Alex Pennig. And boy, is it strange.
Just the title itself kind of throws you off a little bit, right? Like,
Well,
is it really that strange of a shooting? Or, as we kind of peel back the layers of this case, we're going to find out, what really happened.
yeah, exactly. So we have Alex Pennig at the center of it all, and her ex-coworker and one-time fling Matthew Ecker and her boyfriend at the time, Shane Anderson. So where do we even begin?
Well, I think the episode does a really good job of throwing you right into the fire.
Yeah.
They jump right into where the first responders found Alex. And honestly, it's kind of confusing right from the start.
Okay, yeah. So what is it about this scene that's so unusual?
So picture this, right? You walk into the bathroom and Alex is dead with a gun on her left shoulder and her left hand is resting on top of the gun. Okay, straightforward, right? Except Alex was right-handed.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's kind of strange. So did investigators think that maybe this wasn't a suicide after all?
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, it definitely kind of throws up a red flag. Like, was this scene staged? Did somebody place the gun there to make it look like she took her own life? It's definitely something that investigators would hone in on.
But wait, I think there was a military expert that they brought on 48 hours, and he had a different take on the gun's position.
He did. He did. And this is where it gets really interesting, right? So think about the mechanics of loading a pistol,
Yeah.
especially for someone who may not be familiar with guns, right? It's totally possible that in the act of loading the gun, you might hold it in your non-dominant hand for a moment.
Hmm. Okay, that makes sense. And Alex wasn't exactly like a gun enthusiast, right?
Right. Yeah. The episode made it pretty clear that she didn't have any prior experience with guns.
Yeah.
So, having that expert come on and kind of lay that groundwork, I think it makes the scene a little bit less staged and a little bit more open to, maybe this did happen the way that it looks.
Okay, so maybe the gun's position isn't as clear-cut as it seemed at first, but what about Matthew Ecker? The episode seemed to really focus on him and what he was doing after Alex's death.
Yeah. And this is where it really starts to take a turn, right? So initially, Ecker told police that he found Alex with the gun already on her body. Which you would think is pretty standard, right? If you walk in and you see something tragic like that, you're not going to start moving things around, are you?
Right, you just assume you leave everything as it is.
Exactly. But here's the catch. More than 2 hours into this interrogation, Ecker changes his story and admits that he moved the gun. He said he put it in his suitcase first, and then later he took it out of the suitcase and placed it back on Alex.
Wow, that's a pretty big deal. Why would you move a gun at all, if you had nothing to hide? I mean, wouldn't that just make you look suspicious?
You would think, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what the detectives thought. But this became a pivotal moment in the investigation, because now it casts doubt on his credibility. Like, why would you do that if you didn't have something to hide?
So we've got a confusing death scene. We've got a key witness who's acting strangely. Sounds like the investigators had a lot to work with here. What else did we learn about the events leading up to Alex's death from this episode?
Yeah, so this is where it gets even more interesting and even more layered,
Yeah.
right? There's this element of missing text messages. And I know that this is something that you wanted to find out about, like what happened to Alex, right?
Yeah, I mean, and the title of this episode kind of led me to believe that there would be some kind of straightforward answer, but it seems like anything but right now. So what about these text messages?
Well, surveillance footage from Alex's apartment building shows her texting in the lobby, like shortly before she died. And it seemed like such a small detail, right?
But it could be huge. I mean, who was she texting? Was she arguing with someone? Was she scared? Did she have any idea, about what was about to happen?
Exactly. And the problem is investigators could never access her phone. So those messages, whatever they said, they're just lost.
Yeah.
And it just becomes this like frustrating dead end in a case that already has a lot of twists and turns.
Yeah, it's like a missing piece of a puzzle. I mean, those messages could have provided so much context. Maybe she received a threat from Ecker. Maybe it was a cry for help. Maybe it was just a normal conversation. We'll never know, man. This is just getting more and more complicated.
It is. It really is. And I think as we get further into the episode, the question of motive really becomes central. If we entertain the possibility that Ecker was involved in her death, the question becomes why.
Right, because if he staged the scene and lied about the gun, that definitely points to something more sinister. So what would his motive be? I mean, was it passion, jealousy, rage? I mean...
Well, the detectives working the case, they developed a theory that Alex may have threatened to expose the affair to Ecker's wife, which, the classic love triangle gone wrong.
But wait a minute, didn't they say that Ecker was financially supporting her? Like he was paying her rent, he was covering all of her expenses, almost $30,000. Why would she risk losing that by, threatening to expose him?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It seems very counterintuitive that she would jeopardize that financial security, especially if she was relying on it. So we have to kind of go deeper and figure out, what was their relationship really like? And is there something more to this story than meets the eye?
Man, there's just so much to think about here. We got a suspicious death scene, a witness who changed his story, a potential motive that doesn't really make sense, and those missing text messages. It really makes you wonder if, like, technology is a blessing or a curse in these types of investigations.
That's such a good point. And in this case, her phone could really be the key to unlocking the truth of what happened. Imagine like her final moments, her thoughts, her conversations, they could all be trapped inside that device. And because they couldn't get into it, we're just left with this void in the narrative. It's like we're
Yeah.
trying to solve a puzzle with half of the pieces missing.
And they really did try in the episode, right? Like they went through all these different forensic examiners and special software, the whole 9 yards, but nothing worked. So what does that tell you about like the challenges of digital forensics?
Well, I think it highlights this really crucial reality that even with all of the advancements in technology that we have today, there are still limitations to what we can uncover. Sometimes the encryption methods are just too strong, or the data is corrupted beyond repair, and we just have to accept that some answers may remain elusive.
It's kind of a reminder that we live in this world where so much of our lives is like documented electronically, right? Our phones are like these digital extensions of ourselves. They have all our secrets, our fears, our hopes. And when those records are inaccessible, it can really impact our ability to understand, what happened.
Absolutely. And, it makes you think about what this means for future investigations. As technology continues to evolve, are we going to be able to keep up with the challenges of digital forensics? It's a question that goes way beyond this particular case.
For sure. For sure. But let's bring it back to Alex and Ecker for a second. We talked about his financial support of her and how that was kind of puzzling. So are there any other possible explanations for why he would be so generous, especially if it was just a casual fling?
Well, I think we have to consider every angle.
Yeah.
Maybe he was genuinely trying to help her get back on her feet, and the money was just a way of easing his conscience about the affair. Or maybe he was trying to maintain some control over her, by ensuring her silence about their relationship. It's complex,
Yeah.
And without more information, it's really hard to say for certain what his motivations were.
Yeah. And I keep going back to those missing text messages. They could have shed some light on the nature of their financial arrangement. Like, were there promises made? Were there threats? Were there some kind of unspoken agreement? We're just left with so many questions.
It's like we're looking at a tapestry where somebody's just pulled a bunch of the threads loose.
Yeah.
You can kind of see the overall picture, but there are all these crucial details missing. And those details, those could be the key to understanding their dynamic.
Okay, so we've talked about the digital side of things and the whole financial puzzle, but let's go back to that scene in the bathroom for a second. The episode really emphasized how strange it looked. The position of the body, the gun, her hand, it just didn't seem right to the investigators.
And rightfully so. A lot of times when you see staging at a crime scene, it's this kind of desperate attempt to mislead investigators, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to create a narrative that doesn't align with reality. And in this case, the position of the gun, especially given that Alex was right-handed, it raises a lot of red flags.
But then we have that military expert that they brought on 48 Hours, and he offered a different perspective, right? He talked about how somebody who's unfamiliar with firearms, they might handle the gun a little bit differently, especially during that loading process. And it made me wonder, were the detectives so focused on this idea of staging that they maybe overlooked a simpler explanation?
It's totally possible. When you're dealing with a case this complex, it's easy to get tunnel vision. You start looking for evidence that supports your initial theory, and you might miss really crucial details that don't fit neatly into that narrative. It's a reminder that even the most experienced investigators can be susceptible to bias.
So in a way, the military expert's perspective kind of throws a wrench into the whole investigation, right? It's like we're back at square one trying to figure out what really happened in that bathroom.
Exactly. And, it really highlights the importance of considering all possibilities, even the ones that seem unlikely. At first glance, the truth could be right there in front of us, hidden in plain sight, masked by our own preconceived notions.
Okay, so maybe the scene isn't as clear-cut as it seemed at first, but what about Matthew Ecker's behavior? He rushes to Alex's aid, he seems distraught, but then he admits to moving the gun, which makes him look really suspicious. So what do you make of his actions?
That's the million-dollar question, right? His actions are just so ambiguous. On one hand, you have this seemingly caring person who called 911 who was present at the scene, but then you have this really weird decision to move the gun, which makes him look super shady.
Yeah, and his family maintains that he's innocent. They say he's a helpful person and they believe his character wasn't really represented properly at trial. But, it makes you wonder, can compassion and guilt coexist? Can somebody be capable of kindness and at the same time be capable of something much darker?
Yeah, that's a question that really goes to the heart of human nature. We tend to put people in these boxes of good or bad, but in reality, people are much more complex than that.
Yeah.
People are capable of both great acts of love and terrible acts of violence. And sometimes, those seemingly contradictory impulses can exist within the same person.
So we're left grappling with this really unsettling possibility that the person who rushed to her aid might also be the person responsible for her death. It's a lot to think about.
It is, and it
Yeah.
really forces us to confront the limits of our understanding. We want simple answers, we want clear narratives, but real life rarely provides such neat resolutions.
I was thinking about when they found out about her death, Ecker and Shane, and how they reacted.
Oh,
It
yeah.
was really interesting to me.
Yeah, there was such a difference between their responses.
Yeah, Ecker seems so distraught, he's sobbing, he's pacing.
Mhm.
But even some of the first responders were like, is this real? Is he really this upset?
Yeah, they were questioning, the authenticity of his grief.
Yeah.
And then you have Shane, who's like much more stoic and reserved.
Right. It's like, are we judging them for how they're grieving? Like, is there a right way to grieve?
That's such a good point because grief is so personal. There's no right or wrong way to grieve.
Yeah.
Some people are very emotional. Some people internalize it.
Exactly.
You can't really judge someone's truthfulness based on how emotional they appear to be.
Yeah, and it's like you can't assume that just because somebody's crying, they're innocent, or because somebody's not, they're guilty.
Right, exactly.
And I think it's just a reminder to us all that we can't rely on gut feelings or stereotypes when we're trying to
100%.
figure out if somebody's being truthful,
Mm-hmm.
and we have to remember that both of these guys had their own, complicated relationships with Alex.
Of course, yeah.
Ecker was having an affair with her and he was giving her all this money and...
Right, and Shane had that fight with her at the bar,
Exactly.
right before she died.
Yeah, so it's hard to know how much of their reaction is genuine or, influenced by these dynamics.
It is. It's like you're reading a book where some of the pages are ripped out.
Right.
You're just left to kind of guess what was on those missing pages.
Exactly, and it could change the whole story,
Exactly. And I think that brings us back to like one of the most intriguing parts of this whole thing. Like the fact that he was giving her all this money. Like, why would you do that?
If it was just a fling,
Yeah. Yeah.
why go to all that trouble?
Right. It just doesn't make sense.
And I keep thinking, like, if only we had those text messages, maybe we'd have a better idea of, what their agreement was or what kind of power dynamic was at play.
Exactly.
And, we also can't forget that Alex, had her own challenges.
Of course.
Her parents talked about how she had a history of, difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like we're only getting this tiny little glimpse into her life.
Yeah.
She had this whole life before all this happened.
Right. A whole life before
Yeah.
this one incident.
Yeah, and, relationships and dreams and maybe even some demons that we'll never know about.
Right. And that's important to remember, as we do these deep dives,
Yeah.
that we're just getting a small piece of who these people really were.
Absolutely. And I'm sure, this whole thing took a toll on everybody.
Of course.
Her family, her friends, even the investigators.
It's a lot to process, this kind of unresolved mystery.
Yeah, and you're left with all these what ifs, what could they have done differently? What did they miss?
Right.
So where do we land with all of this? I mean,
Right.
the jury found Ecker guilty,
Right.
but his family says he's innocent.
Mhm.
We've examined all the evidence. We've heard all the different sides. And it's still unclear if this was a suicide or if she was murdered.
Yeah. It's frustrating.
So frustrating.
But it's a good reminder that sometimes there are just no easy answers.
Yeah.
The
Right.
truth can be messy,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes we just don't ever get the full picture.
But I guess that's why we do these deep dives,
That's it.
We try to piece everything together.
Exactly. And it makes us challenge our assumptions and, think critically.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that sometimes ambiguity is just part of life.
And that's a wrap on the mysterious death of Alex Pennig.
That's it.
And for you, the listener, what do you think? What stood out to you? What are you still wondering about? Let us know.
Yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Until next time, keep asking those questions.
Keep digging for the truth.
And we'll see you on the next deep dive.